had developed this further to think about the political equator, or just looking at that map and noticing that there is a line that runs through this map from left to right that almost offers an alternative equator in separating the northern and southern hemispheres. And it intersects at certain desert hotspots, and I'll talk a bit about the desert and the kind of European understanding of the desert in a while when I speak about landscape, but it resonated with me because I've been working in southern Spain, in Almeria, in a region that's classed as one of the only deserts in Europe, and thinking about how it not only interested me politically in the way that there was this relationship to northern Morocco and this movement back and forth and this political border, but also symbolically in what the desert represents symbolically. So thinking about how in the European imagination the idea of the American West and outlaws and frontiers and going to the desert to fulfill your desires, to reinvent yourself, alongside the sort of biblical ideas of the desert as being somewhere that you're cast out into the wilderness, you know, the gated city and the wilderness beyond. And playing, you know, with the idea of the symbolic and political connections. And so there's three spaces on this equator that particularly interest me, which are the US-Mexican border, Palestine-Israel, and southern Spain and northern Morocco. And I began to frame my work around that to a degree. So a number of projects turn over this idea in different ways. And thinking about the political... I'll let you read it first and then I'll speak. So thinking about the past, present and future of borders, frontiers, demarcation lines. So thinking about southern Spain and northern Morocco as now Europe and Africa, but southern Spain and France being once occupied, you know, by the Moors, and this constant flux movement of people straddling the Mediterranean Sea. And then thinking about the quote that I just showed you, this idea, I love this idea of the Mediterranean one day disappearing and these two continents rejoining. And thinking about how I might use photography to tease out some of these ideas about connection and separation. So this is a piece of work that I did that was shown in a Brighton Photo Biennial in 2012 called Badlands. It's work I made over 4 years in southern Spain, and it looks at the two main migrant groups occupying the desert landscape of southern Spain. So the migrant golfers, the leisure migrants, the northern European, German, Irish, British living in gated golfing resorts, and then the sub-Saharan and North African, mostly young men who are crossing over by whatever means they can, and using Almeria as a starting point to enter into Europe. And it's a big agricultural industry there. And if they can arrive, get a stamp from the Red Cross to say when they arrived, and remain in Europe for 3 years undetected, they can then apply for their visas and move off. So I was interested in how I might articulate something about the relationship between these two groups, which is a microcosm of what's happening globally. But using architecture and using the landscape and not showing, you know, not presenting people, but thinking about, in this case it was plastic, and thinking about the material and metaphoric qualities of plastic. And I won't talk too much about the project. There's more work on my website if you want to see it. And then from that, so each project leading to another. So each project I'm approaching with a set of questions about landscape, a set of questions about how I might articulate something through photography, and questions about the potentials and limitations of photography. And the more I work with photography, the more frustrated I feel with it, the more a useless medium it seems to be in giving information, but it can suggest. And so I'm pushing at what it can do, and I'll talk more about that in relation to Gardening the Suburbs. This is a piece of work called Imported Landscapes that I did for Manifesta 8, which was in Murcia and Cartagena in the southeast coast of Spain. And I think the premise of the festival was a dialogue between southern Spain and northern Africa. And so I made this project. I made a journey from Tangier all across the northern Moroccan coast, almost to Algeria, and I photographed the built landscape. And then I placed these landscapes onto billboards in 3 specific locations in southern Spain, in Murcia. And I wanted to talk about this relationship, this similarity between the climate, the flora, the fauna, in the sense of the environment being the same, but there being this political divide. And using the photographic language of billboards, which speaks about the American West, or it speaks about there's a particular way of reading a billboard, and wanting to disrupt that way of reading the billboard. So producing very quiet images, as opposed to something that I think you spend 10 seconds on a billboard when you drive past it. If it doesn't have text, if you don't really understand what's going on, maybe it can cause a little intervention in the landscape. And then, so there were 2 stages to the work. There was the site-specific billboard installation that you would encounter in the landscape, and if you had the festival brochure, you would know what it was. You would see a title telling you that it was one location placed in another, but if you encountered it as you were driving past, or were a local resident, as were some of the people that I discussed it with, there's no text to anchor it, and it was very interesting for me to see how, when it's seen in a gallery context, people immediately understand my game. They understand the fact that I'm placing one location in another, and they can use the images as portals to think about connections between these 2 places. But when people encountered them as installations in the landscape, for example, this one, there was a woman who lived just down the road here. She was really upset by this picture because she thought that somebody was going to build on this, which was her land. So she read it as, even though these, you can't see very clearly on here, but even though these are kind of like half-built, rather shabby, not the kind of pictures that you would have on those glossy billboards advertising new gated communities, she read the billboard in that way. So to move on to this work, and I guess which I'd started around the same time, and had come to the region really because I was making these links, and I was thinking about my lineage as a photographer, and looking at landscape photography since the inception of photography, and how that's always been used as another tool to colonise, classify, map land. And I think I should have some pictures. Let me see. Oh, I don't know where they are. Okay, come back to that. But thinking about, so I'm sorry, I had some pictures to show you about the sort of lineage that I'm placing myself in, and then at the same time attempting to break out of. So people like Timothy O'Sullivan, who were commissioned to go to the American West in the 1850s as part of the American surveys, and photograph the landscape as dead space, unoccupied, ripe for colonisation, ripe for people to invest their money there. Francis Frith, who photographed in the Holy Land and found that it didn't fit his concept of this biblical landscape, so moved people out of the way to create again this idea of the desert as dead space, as empty space. And thinking about the visual languages they use, the very monumental landscapes that they're making. And then people like Walker Evans, who were using architecture as well, but looking at vernacular architecture and decoding that vernacular architecture. And then up to the new topographers in the 70s. So all male, apart from Hilla Becker, one of the new topographics photographers, all male, all maybe following this tradition of somehow conquering landscape through photographing it from these certain vantage points, you know, a kind of very Renaissance way of viewing it. So I'm thinking about how I'm part of this lineage, this uncomfortable lineage, and then how I might break this lineage as well. So this is the work that you see in the in the space. This is how I was playing with it last year at University of the Arts. So it's designed to be constantly evolving, morphing to work in any space that it's shown in, and may or may not expand or be dismantled as Israeli settlements expand or are dismantled. So Gardening the Suburbs is one of 3 interconnected projects that are coming under the title Garden State that I've been working on in Palestine, Israel for the last 3 or 4 years, and they'll be exhibited in a solo show in the UK later next year. And they all turn over in some way this idea of the constructed landscape, the suburban garden or the planted forest, and thinking about a combined Zionist neoliberal move to colonise and occupy this territory. And it was very much a process of being in and exploring landscape and feeling my way through it, and coming here feeling I have trying to feel my way through it and how I might articulate something about this landscape, and the military civilian occupation, which for me, after spending some time there, is what struck me as being the most potent, the most frightening, the banal, innocent, seeming slow creeping, insidious creeping of suburban homes, suburban dwellings and suburban gardens. So the work, Gardening the Suburbs, was made over 26 Israeli settlements, from the coastal areas around Tel Aviv right through to the Jordan Valley, and following this shape, the crocodile jaws shape, and looking specifically at quality of life settlements, so-called quality of life settlements, and not looking at religious settlements, but thinking about those that are deemed to be, for example, I always think of, for anybody who knows London, Ma'ali Adumim being sold as a suburb of Jerusalem. You get tax incentives to live there, you might get, they sometimes throw in a car when you buy an apartment in some of these places. It seemed to be what Croydon is to London. And I find that horrifying. And what also I discovered as I was making the work is, so the yellow lines are the roads, this awareness of, because it's always, for me, it's about breaking my conceptions about this region. I thought it was about the green line. No, it's not about the green line, it's about the roads, because that's this grid of roads, Route 6 that you see on the left. You can see on the top this cluster, so I've highlighted the locations I've been in, how on either side of that road, often military families are invited to live there, so that should they need it, there's a whole host of military civilians keyed up for action on these main arteries. So the piece reflects that shape to a degree, and the slides that I'll now show you break it up in this order, and I'll move through from the coastal areas heading east, because I want to talk a little bit about how how the landscape design changes. So I think this is Ashdod and Holon and places, so very generic looking seaside gated communities that could be in California, they could be in southern Spain. And then, so to think about a little bit about the photographic language that I'm using. So I've said I'm trying to avoid this, or being very conscious of the single image containing everything, and really not agreeing with that, I think if you have text with an image, it can anchor meaning to a degree, but wanting to suggest the limitations of photography, essentially. So I'm doing two things. I'm giving you only fragments So I'm offering you a landscape, and it's a landscape of my own shaping, you know. I think as a photographer, it's important that I acknowledge that I'm not just interpreting a language, but I'm also a landscape, but I'm also shaping a landscape. This is my curated version of this place, and it's only one layer of many different landscapes that you could tune into in this region. And I'm giving you just these little fragments of a broken grid, with the hope, in a way, that you don't turn away in the frustration at not being offered much or not being able to go very far, but that it can somehow invite the viewer to think about the connections between the images and think about what maybe lies in the gaps between the images. The other thing I'm doing is not letting you in very far, so all the pictures have a very shallow depth of field. They hold you out almost, and my intention is that the piece as a whole is quite claustrophobic. You never really see the wider landscape, you never have a wide vista, and you're always held back. And I was thinking about the facade of the Israeli state, and this idea of thinking that Ma'ale Adumim is a very convenient and a reasonably priced suburb of Jerusalem, you know, and choosing not to look at the other reasons for it being there, and how I might suggest this facade or this laying on the landscape, the Palestinian landscape, and not quite connecting with the landscape, but this desire to connect. So this is, I can't remember where it is, but it's somewhere in the northern, slightly older settlement, and you see these seemingly mature-looking gardens, and they get wilder as you get further north, and as you get further east, they take on they're kind of more wild and sensual-looking, but they stop you. They don't. They're not actually that mature. And you can never get very far into them, and I've tried to suggest that with the photographs. And I think I moved on from thinking about architecture, which was, I've been looking at reading architecture, reading the landscape through architecture for a number of years. And then just tuning. It took me a long time to allow myself to make this work, because there is a banality to these places. There isn't. They're not supercharged. I'm used to seeing very violent pictures of violent landscapes of Palestine, and it took me a long time to allow myself to make these pictures, to feel that it, you know, that I could articulate something. And I think that really came through very strongly. So I'd set the intention, and I'd been making the work, and one day, I'll come back to that, I'd been photographing in Kiryat Arba, which is just on the outskirts of Hebron, and I think there's 3 or 4 settlements within Hebron, and Kiryat Arba is like overlooking it, and it's considered a quality of life settlement, and it's just a very hideous, violent feeling place, and that landscape to me, surrounding it, as I left, I just felt I really felt it in a very bodily level, the violence in the landscape and the ugliness. And I realised that all the pictures I'd ever seen of Palestine had never come anywhere near to me having that experience that I had that day. And it really reinforced this idea of the futility of photography as a way to allow a viewer to hold on to something, to have agency almost. How might I be able to do that? And this coming full circle and going in the absolute opposite direction and showing you this repetition of banality, this repetition of Japanese-style gardens, or the sort of French-style garden, or the British, that are all represented in these pictures, you know, and you can see how the different gardening styles have changed trend throughout the decades, and also as you head east, where people begin to use more rocks, for example. There's a sort of, I feel there's an attempt, what I observe is an attempt to fuse with the landscape, to lay down roots. So this idea of gardens, you know, why gardens and not architecture? Well, gardening has particular representational qualities when you think about it in the context of nationalism, or you think about, you know, the sort of the metaphors, the idea of putting down roots, the idea that you only build a garden if you intend to stay somewhere. But yeah, wanting to use a completely different visual language to try and have a sense of the horror, this creeping, you know, creeping horror of what these places are doing. And so the piece moves, and if you've managed to have a look at it, it starts off quite dense, so around the coastal areas, and it spreads out as it moves east, and I give this suggestion only sort of at the drop-off points of what lies beyond, and this idea of it steadily marching across the mountains. So pictures like this are the only time when you see something beyond the tight frames that I previously offered. Maybe just to go back to those pictures of the maps. So I've been collecting maps, and I've been comparing maps and finding that utterly fascinating to see what maps include what information. So thinking about how this is one loose mapping that I'm making. I'm shaping a landscape, and I'm offering you a landscape, or I'm offering you a map. And I came across this novel, this noir novel, China Miéville, I think a British writer, who, The City and the City, and in this book, his premise is the occupants, the denizens of one city living alongside another city that is occupying the same territory, and they're not allowed to view it. It's illegal for them to access this other city, even though through their peripheral vision they're conscious of it. And they purposefully choose to zone it out. And thinking about how that might apply to this place, and this conscious choosing not to see, and this conscious forming one landscape on another. So how that comes through, for example, in the naming of places, and what it does that now I think there's 10 Hebrew place names to every Arabic place name. And what that does to the next generation, the new generation of Palestinian children who now no longer call whatever the Mali Adumim Road, I can't remember what it was called, but they now know it as the Mali Adumim Road, not the previous Palestinian name. And I think this is Alfei Menashe. And when I was there photographing, so I could access the settlements. I had a car with Israeli plates, so I could access all the settlements. They would let me through the barriers with no problem. And I could go around and photograph, and that's when being a woman and photographing gardens is incredibly useful, because I'm just not seen to be a threat to anybody. And I did get a lot of questions asked, and I did get filmed and photographed by people, but on the whole I was just left to be able to make this work. And one woman commented when I was photographing here, "What are you doing here? This is the end of the world." What was she doing there? So maybe just to talk a little bit about this. So this is the first time that I've shown this work. So I've sort of played around with it at the university, as you saw in that earlier picture. And through this invitation from Sharuk and then the dialogue we had around it, it's become a much richer project as a result, I think, and it's really made me think about different possibilities of showing the work. So you'll see that there's not only the wall installation, but there's plants in the space. And Sharuk mentioned that through thinking about the work, they decided to name all their plants, but we've also brought other plants into the space. And I've also, so talking about my photographic lineage, also thinking about my British lineage and the British involvement in 48, and how do I suggest that? How might I bring that in? And particularly thinking about when I show this work in the UK, how, just as Shuruk wants his work to speak to this place, I'm also thinking about how I want it to speak to that place, and how I might almost close the circle or further develop this idea of wanting the audience to have agency and wanting viewers to have agency and to participate in some way, and you know, I feel as a collective responsibility. So I found Shuruk had suggested that we bring plants into the space in some way, and I wasn't sure at all how I was going to do that. I didn't feel I could do it until I was here and we were working together. But I spent the previous week in Ramallah, so this work was produced in part when I was staying with a resident with the AM Katan Foundation, and I was there last week. I'm wanting to make an artist book of this, so I was out there speaking to some writers that I'll be collaborating with, and I had an afternoon off, and I sneaked off to a swimming pool, which felt a very indulgent thing to do. But I read a book on social practices of gardening, and came across this chapter about the relationship between military practices and gardening practices, and it just felt like, this is what I've been looking for the last few years. And it listed these plants that are all named after British generals, colonels, and weapons, aeroplanes, you know. So I think there's the ambush azalea and the Winston Churchill aster, which was like which absolutely closed the circle for me. So just that little introduction of these plants, I feel, makes it complete somehow, and hopefully creates that link between not only between me, because I think the other thing that I'm trying to do with landscape photography is not have this monument, you know, the very sort of male colonial man stood on the top of a hill photographing the wide vista, but thinking about my bodily participation in landscape and how landscape is something that's shaped by us, and we are shaped by landscape, and my research process, which is very much about walking and looking and listening and tuning in, and so wanting to bring that subjectivity back. Shall we have some questions?
Yeah, and can I suggest that whoever's supposed to be the window opens it, now that we don't have to worry, that opens it.